Richardson gave a short nod, his phone already at his ear as he walked a few steps away, calling in whatever federal resources were needed. The younger officer, the one who had hesitated throughout the night, finally found his voice. I didn't know, he stammered. They told us to move in fast, that he was a threat. I swear, I didn't know it was a setup. James studied him for a moment. The kid was shaken, his face pale with realization. Maybe he really hadn't known. Maybe he was just another pawn in someone else's game. But the lead officer, that was different. He was silent now, his posture rigid, his gaze locked on some invisible point beyond the crowd. He knew something. Michelle took a step closer to him, her voice steady but firm. I'd start talking if I were you. Because once this gets out, and it will, you're going to want people to know which side you were really on. The officer's jaw tightened, but for the first time, James saw something shift in his eyes. Not fear, resignation. He knew the fallout was coming. The sirens in the distance were fading now. The second suspect, the real suspect, had been caught. The police had wasted precious time chasing James, while the real threat moved freely. That fact alone would be impossible to ignore. James took a slow breath, rolling his shoulders, trying to shake off the tension. His wrists still burned from the cuffs. His suit was ruined. His family's night had been wrecked, but he was still standing. And now he had something his enemies clearly didn't want him to have: questions. He turned to Michelle. We need to pull every record on this case, every name attached to it. She nodded, already on it. The wedding guests were slowly dispersing, murmuring in clusters, shaking their heads at what they had just witnessed. The bride, James' niece, was still watching from a few feet away, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She had been silent through most of this, but now she stepped forward. This was supposed to be my wedding day, she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. And instead, I watched my uncle get dragged away in handcuffs for something he didn't do. James met her gaze. I'm sorry. She shook her head. No, I'm sorry that this is still happening. James had no words for that, because she was right. This wasn't just about him. It was about the system, about the way things worked and didn't work, about how fast things could spiral when the wrong people had power. He looked back at Richardson, who had just ended his call. The agent met his gaze. We'll dig into this, he said, but be careful. Whoever did this, he gestured toward the phone in James' hand. They aren't done. James exhaled. He already knew that, but he also knew something else. Neither was he. As the last of the flashing lights disappeared down the street and the wedding party tried to salvage what was left of their night, James stood still, staring at the dark horizon. He didn't know who was behind this yet. He didn't know why they wanted him out of the way. But he would find out. And when he did, they wouldn't see him coming. He hesitated for a split second, then clicked. A video file loaded onto the screen. The footage was grainy, like it had been recorded from a security camera. At first, it was hard to make out, but then James recognized the location, the same street where he had been arrested. The timestamp was from earlier that day, just before the incident. He leaned in closer, watching as a different car pulled up. A black SUV. Two men stepped out, both in plain clothes, but something about them was familiar. James froze. One of them was the cop who had arrested him. The other? Someone higher up. Someone James had seen before. His stomach twisted as he realized where. A week ago, during an internal briefing, he had been in the same room as that man. He wasn't just a cop. He was connected to the department in a way that ran deeper than street patrols. James racked his brain, trying to remember his name. Then it hit him. Detective Marcus Raines. The video continued, and James watched as Raines handed something to the officer. An envelope. Thick. It wasn't hard to guess what was inside. A payoff. James' pulse quickened. This wasn't just a case of mistaken identity. It was a setup. But why? And why him? Before he could process it fully, another notification popped up on his screen. This time, it wasn't an email. It was a system alert. Someone was trying to access his files. James immediately moved to shut everything down, fingers flying across the keyboard. But whoever was on the other end was fast, too fast. His screen glitched, and suddenly, his entire system locked. A single message appeared. Asterisk, asterisk, walk away, agent. Last warning. Asterisk, asterisk. James slammed the laptop shut, his heart pounding. Someone wasn't just watching him. They were inside his system, inside his world. And now they knew he was onto them. James stared at the dark screen of his laptop, his pulse hammering. The warning was clear. Whoever was behind this had power, access, and the confidence to threaten a federal agent without hesitation. But that only made him more determined. He wasn't walking away. He grabbed his phone and dialed Carter. "I need you to meet me. Now." Carter didn't ask questions. "Where?" "Somewhere quiet." Minutes later, they met in a dimly lit parking garage, the kind of place where conversations stayed private. James didn't waste time. He pulled out his phone and showed Carter the video. Rains was there. Before the arrest, he handed the officer something. This wasn't a mistake. This was planned. Carter's expression darkened. "That explains a lot. But why you?" James shook his head. "I don't know yet. But someone inside our system is trying to shut me down. They locked my laptop. If they can do that, they know what I've seen." Carter exhaled sharply, running a hand over his face. "We need to move fast." He glanced around, lowering his voice. "I have a contact. Someone in cyber forensics. If they hacked you, we can trace them back." They drove in silence to a safe location where Carter's contact, a tech specialist named Mia, was already waiting. She plugged in James' laptop, her fingers flying over the keyboard. The screen flickered, then came back to life. Mia's eyes widened. This isn't just a routine hack. They planted something. James leaned in. "Planted what?" She pointed at a hidden file deep in his system. "It's a setup. They're trying to pin something on you." James' blood ran cold. It wasn't just about shutting him up. They were trying to frame him. Before he could respond, his phone rang. Unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. A voice, calm and familiar, came through. "I told you to walk away." James' grip tightened on the phone. "Not my style." The voice sighed. "Then you leave me no choice." The call ended. Maya looked up, alarmed. "James, we have a problem." She turned the screen toward him. His FBI credentials, his entire work profile, were being erased in real time. James felt his stomach drop. They weren't just setting him up. They were erasing him. Carter grabbed his arm. "We need to go. Now." But before they could move, the parking lot outside flooded with headlights. Black SUVs. Doors opening. Heavy footsteps. Then, stepping out of the lead vehicle, Detective Marcus Rains. He adjusted his coat, watching James with something between amusement and warning. "You had every chance to walk away." James squared his shoulders. "And you had every chance to do the right thing." Rains chuckled. "That's not how the world works, Agent." He gestured behind him, and two men stepped forward. "But don't worry. We'll make sure your story ends properly." James glanced at Carter. No words were needed. They weren't going down without a fight. "He matches the description of a suspect." A few people in the crowd gasped. Others scoffed. James narrowed his eyes. "What description?" Silence. No real answer. Just a vague justification that could mean anything. A standard line. Something easy to say when they had nothing else. His jaw clenched. He knew this game. He had worked in intelligence long enough to recognize when someone was covering their tracks. But this time, he wasn't on the other side of it. This time, he was the target. And then, something changed. Another officer approached. He looked younger, maybe new to the force. He glanced around, seeing the cameras, the growing anger of the crowd. For the first time, there was hesitation. He leaned toward his superior and muttered something. The lead officer's expression darkened. James watched closely. He could see the shift, the realization that they might have made a mistake. But would they admit it? Or would they double down? The guests were still pushing for answers. Some were already on the phone, calling lawyers, calling news stations. James knew how these situations could end. He had seen it before. Sometimes the truth didn't matter. Sometimes the only thing that mattered was control. And right now, they had all the control. The night wasn't over. And neither was the fight for the truth. The crowd wasn't letting this go. Voices grew louder, the frustration rising like heat in the night air. The guests weren't just bystanders anymore. They were witnesses, standing together, demanding answers. Phones stayed raised, recording every second, every movement, every word. The officers had to know this was getting out of control. But instead of backing down, they seemed more determined to end this on their terms. James stayed still, his hands still locked behind his back. His breathing was steady, but his mind was racing. He had trained for high-stakes situations, but nothing had prepared him for being treated like this. Like he was nothing more than a suspect, a problem that needed to be handled. The younger officer, the one who had hesitated earlier, looked uneasy now. His eyes flicked to the lead officer, then to the crowd. Maybe he was realizing this wasn't what he signed up for. Maybe he was starting to question whether they were making a mistake. But he wasn't speaking up, not yet. Then another voice cut through the noise. A woman, sharp, clear. "I'm his lawyer." Heads turned. A woman in her 40s, dressed in a sleek black dress, stepped forward. Michelle Langston, James' longtime friend and attorney. She had been inside the reception hall when the chaos erupted, but now she was here, moving with purpose, her heels clicking against the pavement. "You need to release him. Now." Her tone left no room for argument. The lead officer barely glanced at her. "Ma'am, this doesn't concern you." Michelle's eyes narrowed. "It does when you're arresting my client without cause. I assume you have probable cause? A warrant? Evidence?" She stepped closer. "Or is this just another one of those mistaken identity situations?" The officer clenched his jaw. He wasn't expecting this. Maybe he thought this would be easy, that no one would push back. But now he had a lawyer in his face, a growing crowd of angry wedding guests, and multiple phones capturing every second. Still, he didn't back down. "We received a report of a suspect matching his description," he repeated, as if saying it again would make it true. Michelle folded her arms. "And I assume you verified that report before throwing him to the ground at his own family's wedding?" The officer didn't answer. James exhaled slowly. He knew how this worked. He had been part of the system for years. He had seen cases like this play out too many times. But knowing didn't make it any easier. It didn't erase the fact that right now he wasn't a decorated federal agent in their eyes. He was just a man they had decided to take down. A new voice entered the conversation. The bride's father, James' older brother Thomas. He was a quiet man, usually the calmest person in the room. But not now. "This is my daughter's wedding," Thomas said, his voice shaking with anger. "And you just turned it into a crime scene." He took a step forward. "You've made a mistake, and we all know it." For a brief moment, something flickered across the officer's face. Uncertainty. Doubt, but it was gone in an instant. "This isn't the place to have this discussion," he said coldly. Michelle let out a dry laugh. Oh, it was the place for an arrest. The tension was unbearable now. The officers were in too deep, and they knew it. They had a decision to make: dig in further or admit fault. James watched them carefully. He had been in too many negotiations to miss the signs. They were looking for a way out. But the question was, what would they do next? Michelle crossed her arms, her expression sharp. "So, let me get this straight. You had the wrong description the entire time." The crowd reacted instantly, gasps and murmurs spreading like wildfire. The bride's father, James' brother, let out a bitter laugh. Unbelievable. The lead officer clenched his jaw, still refusing to meet anyone's gaze. The DOJ agents didn't look surprised. It was as if they had expected this. Richardson let the silence stretch before speaking. "We're going to need full documentation of this incident. Body cam footage, radio logs, all of it." For the first time, the lead officer looked truly uneasy. "That information isn't available right now." James narrowed his eyes. That was a lie. Body cam footage didn't just disappear. Radio logs didn't just go missing. He had spent enough time in intelligence to know when someone was stalling for time. And then something clicked. They weren't just covering up a mistake. They were covering something else, something deliberate. James took a step forward, his voice low. "This wasn't an accident, was it?" The lead officer's expression didn't change, but the slight shift in his posture told James everything he needed to know. The DOJ agents exchanged a glance, like they had come to the same realization. This wasn't about mistaken identity. This was something much bigger. And James was at the center of it. James' mind raced. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture they created was far more dangerous than he had expected. This wasn't just about a wrongful arrest. This wasn't just a mistake. Someone had set this up. Someone wanted him out of the way. And the police officers, whether they knew it or not, had been part of it. Richardson, the DOJ agent, seemed to come to the same realization. He turned back to the officers, his voice calm but edged with authority. "I'm going to ask one more time. Where is the original report?" The lead officer hesitated again. That split second of hesitation was enough. James took a step forward, his voice lower now, controlled. "You didn't pick me up at random." He wasn't asking a question. He was stating a fact. "Someone fed you that description. Someone made sure I'd be here, in a place where I couldn't just disappear without people noticing. And you," he nodded toward the lead officer, "played your part." The younger officer shifted uncomfortably, but his superior remained stone-faced. Then the radio crackled again, but this time the voice wasn't from dispatch. It was another officer's voice, rushed and urgent. "Command, we have a problem. There's been another sighting of the actual suspect. He's armed, engaging now." The color drained from the lead officer's face. James caught it immediately. The panic wasn't about the suspect. It was about exposure. Whoever had set this up hadn't expected it to unravel so quickly. Michelle stepped in again, her voice like steel. "You need to start talking, or we start filing charges." The lead officer's hands clenched at his sides, but before he could respond, one of the wedding guests, an older woman who had been watching everything, spoke up. "I know what this is," she said, shaking her head. "It's a setup. They were trying to make him disappear." The words sent a ripple through the crowd. James felt it too, the weight of the truth finally coming into focus. And then the final piece fell into place. James' phone, still in Michelle's possession, buzzed. She glanced down at the screen and frowned before handing it over. "Unknown number," she said. James hesitated, then answered, "Carter." A distorted voice came through, low and mechanical. That was a warning. A chill ran down his spine. He stepped away from the crowd, gripping the phone tighter. "Who is this?" Silence. Then, click. The call ended. James exhaled sharply, his pulse pounding. Someone had wanted him out of the way. But when the plan didn't go as expected, they changed tactics. This wasn't over, not even close. He turned back to Richardson. "I need to see everything. Every report, every call, every name attached to this case." Richardson nodded, already pulling out his phone. "We'll get to the bottom of it." But James wasn't so sure. Because whoever had done this wasn't finished yet. James stood in the dim light, his phone still clenched in his hand. The weight of the call lingered in the air, a silent confirmation that this wasn't over. Someone had set this up, someone powerful enough to manipulate local law enforcement and bold enough to send a warning even after their plan had failed. He glanced at Michelle, at Richardson, at the expectant faces of his family and the wedding guests. They were all waiting for something, for answers, for justice, for reassurance that the night's chaos meant something. And how much worse could this night get before it was over? The air was thick with tension. Every second that passed felt stretched, like a rope pulled too tight, ready to snap. The wedding guests weren't just watching anymore. They were waiting, holding their breath, expecting something to happen. No one knew what, but everyone could feel it. The officers, the family, the bride with tears streaking her face. It was a moment frozen in time, teetering on the edge of something bigger. James' wrists ached from the tight cuffs, but he barely noticed. His focus was on the lead officer, the one who was now shifting uncomfortably under the weight of dozens of eyes, dozens of cameras recording every move. The situation had escalated beyond what they expected. Maybe they thought they could handle this quietly, get in, make the arrest, leave without pushback. But now there was no easy way out. Michelle stepped even closer, her voice sharp. "If you don't release him now, you'll have a lawsuit before the night is over. You'll have to explain why you arrested a federal agent, without cause, in front of multiple witnesses and live recordings." She tilted her head slightly. "I hope your department is ready for that kind of attention." The younger officer shifted on his feet, clearly nervous now. He glanced at his superior, waiting for a response, but the lead officer's face remained unreadable. He was stalling. Then the sound of approaching sirens cut through the night. Another set of flashing lights appeared down the street. Another vehicle. This time, not just a patrol car, something bigger. A black SUV rolled to a stop. The doors opened, and two men in suits stepped out. Their presence alone changed everything. They weren't local police. They weren't regular law enforcement. These were federal agents. The crowd murmured, the tension twisting into something new, uncertainty. Even the officers looked surprised. The lead officer straightened up, clearly realizing he might be in over his head. One of the agents, a tall man with sharp eyes, stepped forward, pulling out his credentials. Special Agent Richardson, Department of Justice. His tone was controlled but firm. "We need to have a conversation. Now." The lead officer hesitated, then nodded stiffly. "We were responding to a suspect match." Richardson didn't blink. "You're detaining a CIA operative at a private event without evidence. Do you have an arrest warrant?" The officer didn't answer. The silence stretched too long. That was all the confirmation Richardson needed. The other agent turned to James, his expression unreadable. "Are you injured?" James gave a small shake of his head. He was fine, physically at least. Richardson looked back at the lead officer. "You're going to remove those cuffs." A flicker of resistance flashed across the officer's face, but he knew he had no choice. The cameras were on. The DOG was here. The pressure was mounting from every side. Slowly, almost reluctantly, he stepped forward and unlocked the cuffs. James exhaled as he pulled his arms forward, rubbing his sore wrists. He stood up slowly, not saying a word, but locking eyes with the man who had just humiliated him in front of his family. The tension wasn't gone. If anything, it was worse now, because this wasn't over. Not yet. James flexed his wrists, feeling the burn where the cuffs had been. The moment should have felt like a victory. He was free. The officers had been forced to back down. The DOG was here, watching everything, but something still wasn't right. He could feel it in his gut. The way the lead officer avoided eye contact. The tension in the air that hadn't eased, even with his release. This wasn't just a mistake. It was something bigger. Richardson turned to the officers, his expression unreadable. "I want to see the original report that led to this arrest. Now." The lead officer hesitated. His hand twitched toward his radio, then stopped. He was caught, and he knew it. If he admitted they had nothing solid, it could mean serious trouble. But if he kept pushing, it could be worse. Then, before he could answer, his radio crackled to life. "All units, we have an update on the suspect description," a voice came through. "Correction on height and build. Suspect is 6'4", approximately 250 pounds. Armed and last seen near." The voice cut off suddenly, as if someone had silenced it on purpose. James' stomach dropped. He wasn't 6'4". He wasn't 250 pounds. He wasn't even close. And yet, they still tackled him, still threw him to the ground, still cuffed him in front of his family. The pieces weren't adding up. The younger officer took a half step back. He had heard it too. His eyes darted between James and his superior, like he was putting the puzzle together in real time. The air was filled with the sound of laughter, clinking glasses, and music. A beautiful evening. A wedding celebration in full swing. Friends and family had gathered to witness love, to share joy, to dance the night away. But in a matter of minutes, that joy would turn into shock. That celebration would turn into chaos. Among the guests was James Carter, a well-respected man. A former CIA agent. A man who had dedicated his life to protecting this country, serving in dangerous missions most people would never know about. He wasn't just any guest. He was family to the bride. And tonight, he was simply here to celebrate, to relax, to enjoy a rare moment of peace. Then, the police arrived. It started as a murmur through the crowd. A few whispers, a few confused glances. No one knew why they were here, but the presence of multiple officers at a wedding was enough to make people uneasy. And then, before anyone could fully process what was happening, they were moving toward James. "Put your hands up." The command sliced through the night, stopping conversations, silencing laughter. James turned, his face calm but confused. He had no idea why they were here. No idea why they were targeting him. He wasn't resisting. He wasn't causing trouble. And yet, within seconds, they were grabbing him, pulling his arms behind his back, tightening cuffs around his wrists. The guests watched in shock. Some tried to intervene, asking what was going on. The bride herself, his own niece, begged them to stop. "He's done nothing wrong," she cried, but the officers ignored her. They ignored all of them. James tried to speak. "I'm a federal agent," he told them, his voice steady despite the growing tension. "This is a mistake." But they didn't care. They didn't listen. Instead, they pushed him down. Hard. Gasps filled the air. Someone started recording. Someone else screamed. The moment was surreal. A man who had spent years protecting others, now being treated like a criminal, at his own family's wedding. The same hands that had carried classified intelligence, that had saved lives, that had upheld the law, were now forced behind his back as if he were a threat. But here's the shocking part. James Carter fit the description of a suspect in the area. That's what they claimed. That's the reason they gave. A vague, flimsy excuse to justify their actions. But anyone watching could see the truth, could feel it. This wasn't about justice. This was about something else. The cameras were rolling now, the videos spreading, people demanding answers. Would they come? Would the truth come out before it was too late? Or would this be another case swept under the rug? This is the story they don't want you to see. And tonight, we're exposing everything. Stay tuned. James Carter lay face down on the pavement, his cheek pressed against the cold concrete. The weight of an officer's knee dug into his back. The voices around him blurred into a mix of outrage and confusion. Someone was shouting his name. Someone was crying. The wedding, just moments ago a scene of happiness, had turned into a nightmare. His mind raced. How did this happen? How did a night meant for celebration turn into this? He had spent years in dangerous situations, missions that put his life on the line, but he had never felt this kind of helplessness. This wasn't a battlefield. This wasn't an enemy operation. This was home, surrounded by people he loved. And yet, he was being treated like a threat. One of the officers yanked him up roughly, forcing him onto his knees. Another patted him down, searching for weapons. James could feel the adrenaline surging through him, but he kept his voice steady. "I need you to check my credentials. I'm a federal agent. You're making a mistake." But they didn't stop. The officer holding him smirked. "Yeah, and I'm the president," he muttered under his breath, tightening the cuffs. The guests weren't standing still anymore. They were demanding answers, shouting at the officers. The groom, a longtime friend of James, stepped forward, his hands up. "You don't understand. He's not who you think he is. Just check his ID." The lead officer turned, his expression unreadable. "Sir, step back." The groom didn't move. "Not until you tell us why you're doing this." The tension was thick. A few guests are already filming, their phones capturing every second. The bride, tears running down her face, begged again. "Please, let him go. He's innocent." But the officers weren't backing down. James took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. He had been in enough high-pressure situations to know that losing control wouldn't help. But there was something about the way they looked at him, like he wasn't a man, like he wasn't worth listening to. Then, one of the officers finally spoke.